Today I want to look at creating a feeling of depth by using values, tints, and tones. And to do that I'm going to go back to a picture that I've used for many, many years. This will be an exercise in atmospheric perspective, meaning that as things get farther away they will reduce in contrast, and in this case they will become lighter and less distinct, maybe even with an atmospheric haze. I'm going to be using some basic acrylic paint, and I have a piece of multimedia paper here as well as a worksheet that I put together with this image on it. You'll notice that there are directions written on the worksheet, and there are some places underneath this tree where I've got a place you can put block lettering. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at where the picture is. I'm going to mark that off on this side. I'm going to show you how to use a very dark pencil to create what we used to call carbon paper. In this case, it's graphite paper. I'm covering the back of the image part of this picture with dark graphite from this ebony pencil. And I'm doing this specifically because I want to transfer the contour line drawing from the front of this worksheet onto this multi-purpose paper. You can see here that the graphite I'm putting down will come off on most anything that touches it, including my finger. The graphite must be dark and very complete, or you will have gaps in your image and light areas that you may not wish. I am then folding this worksheet on the fold line so that the height of it matches the height of the multi-purpose paper that I wish to transfer it to. I'm going to show you here that anytime I press on the front, it transfers to whatever is underneath it. This could be the table, it could be the wall, and in this case it's going to be the multi-purpose paper that I'm going to tape down so that it doesn't move around. And then I'm going to go get a ballpoint pen. I'm going to use a ballpoint pen because it gives firm, even pressure. I could do this with a pencil that wasn't very sharp either, but I can't do it with a felt tip pen because the pressure will not be enough to transfer through. And you can see that I can sort of bend it up occasionally and look underneath it, as long as I don't move things around, to make sure that it is in fact transferring. You can see that I'm evenly pressing down on every contour line that I have in the image and trying to connect everything and make sure it is complete. And wherever I press really firmly with this ballpoint pen, the picture transfers underneath in graphite on the page below. And as long as the page on top does not move in relationship to the page below, I should get an uninterrupted copy of this image from the worksheet onto the multi-purpose paper below. I have also added some block lettering here in the darker area that's going to be the rock that the tree is growing from. Notice that I've added several rectangles, but remember, not all letters are the same size, so I might have to readjust those and not use exactly the same rectangles that I put down. The important part for block lettering is that the height of the top and the base on the bottom that they sit are all the same so that they come out nice and even. In the end, I double check everything twice to make sure I've got all my lines, and then I'm going to draw in any that I might be missing after the fact. I'm going to continue on from here with the rest of the directions. So the next thing on the list is to paint the sky and water with a transparent wash of sunset colors. So the word wash means that we use a lot of water, and we're going to put it directly in our paint and onto the surface that we're painting so that the colors will spread and blend. You can do this with watercolor in particular, but you can also do it very nicely with acrylic paint. You just need to realize that once the acrylic paint is set in place, it's not going to move around after it's dried. So here I'm starting with some violet in the center. These are my sunset colors, just a little bit, and you see how washed out it is? That's why we call it a wash. Next I'm going to go around the color wheel, so into the violet I mix some red, and I know that those two will blend nicely together. See how I'm keeping it wet? If I let it dry, since this is acrylic paint, it will cause an edge that won't blend. But if I keep it wet all of the time through, it will blend one color into the other. And I don't have very much paint in my solution, so you can see the lines that you've drawn through the colors that are put down. Notice that next to the red I'm placing orange. I'm going around the color wheel so I only have analogous colors next to each other. And finally I'm going to finish up on the outside with some yellow. If I had put the yellow next to the violet, where they mix together, they would make brown, and I would have very stormy and ugly skies. But since the yellow is next to the orange, it works to blend. And since the orange is next to the red, it blends as well, and the red blends with the violet. Analogous colors blend harmoniously. Complementary colors, like yellow and violet, would make browns and tone each other down. Now you may have noticed that I have allowed the paper to dry, and it is not curling as much as it was before. At this point I'm going to be using tints, tones, and shades to create an illusion of depth, and I'm going to select one color. In this case I have quite a bit of orange. I'm going to use the orange for the hills, and my directions say to paint the hills lighter and less intense in color as they recede or get farther from us. So I look for the farthest hill that I can, and I mix just a little bit of orange with quite a bit of white so that I get a very light peachy color. And I'm not adding any water to it at this point. I'm going to make it thick enough so it's going to cover over the wash where I don't want the wash in the background to be seen. Once I get the kind of color that I want back there, a very light tint, I'm going to paint it in. Did you notice how I twirled the tip of my round pointed brush so that I got a finer tip on the end? I'm not pressing the brush down so that the hairs spread. I'm actually just using the very, very tip of the brush. If I let the hairs spread, I would not get the detail that I'm looking for. I'm very careful to flat paint this distant hill because I can't see a lot of details in it. I don't want to put a lot of details into it. To flat paint it, I'm using a lot of horizontal strokes, not a lot of strokes along the edges, mostly horizontal, and I'm going right up onto that line that I drew on the outside. I'm trying not to go over the line. I'm trying not to go under the line. I want to go right on the line. Now you see that I've started on some more hills that are a little closer to us, and I added just a little bit more orange in to do that. It gives it a little bit of a darker tint. I've tinted the hill farthest from us very light, and then I'm still tinting these hills, but not nearly as light as the hill that's in the very, very back of the picture. Now I'm sure that you have guessed that as we get closer and closer, I'm going to start toning instead of just tinting. So I'm adding some of this gray that I've mixed up to the orange as I get closer to us. And I'm using that as highlights a little bit in the background too, but I'm washing them out just enough. I'm tinting them a little bit lighter gray so that they add some contrast to the distance, but not a lot of detail. Now I'm sure that you've surmised we're going to be shading a lot of the color in the foreground. I am still using the same orange that I started with, but this time I'm mixing it with black, and it makes a dark brown that's going to work very nicely painting in the foreground. Notice that I'm also still painting right up to the line with horizontal strokes and then making sure that I go right onto the line that I've drawn around everything. You'll see that I'm leaving some highlights that have been drawn in before to make them a little bit lighter. To make them a little bit lighter, I can do a couple of things. I can revert to my tones, or I can go and mix it with a little bit of white or gray. Either way, I can make it lighter so that it highlights. At this point, I want to stress craftsmanship is all important. I make sure that I paint inside the lines and onto the edge of the lines. If I paint over the lines, I get sloppy, but I can cover over it with acrylic paint when things dry. So I know that I can fix those problems. But the fewer problems I have at this point, the less I will have to fix in the future. We started with a wash of colors over the sky and the water, and that was fairly messy. But I know that I can cover over top of that wash with darker, valued colors like this on the tree and the rock. I'm using that medium-sized brush to get a lot of the detail in, but I'm going to end up switching to an even smaller brush to get the details on the edges of the branches of the tree. By just using the tip of this tiny brush, I can get those details in. But if I use a larger brush, a brush that's too big for the job, or if I press the brush down, I can't get that sort of detail in there. I'm going to take a moment now and I'm going to talk about the basic rules of perspective that we're covering here. The first one is surface placement. If you look at the hills in the distance in particular, but even the tree and the rock, you can see that as things are farther from us, the bottom of them where they sit on the ground tends to be higher up on the page. That's rule number one, surface placement. The second rule is size difference. There's a massive hill in the distance, but it's much smaller than the rocks up front. By creating the difference in size and making things that are large in the distance small and things that are smaller in the foreground large, we create the illusion of depth. Everything in this picture is overlapped by something else. The rocks in the foreground overlap each other, the tree overlaps things in the distance, everything in the distance overlaps the sky. That overlapping effect creates a feeling of depth as well. That's rule number 3. Value changes is rule number 5, and the way this picture is laid out, things are lighter in the distance than they are close up. We have silhouettes in the foreground and then flat values that are light in the background. That's the basis of atmospheric perspective, and it works that way outside on usually very bright days. Or even hazy days will give us a forced atmospheric perspective as things disappear into mist. Rule number 6 is contrast or density. As things go way back in the distance, they lose their detail, they lose the contrast of the objects in the foreground. There's less detail that we can see, and because things get smaller and more distant. Normally we leave foreshortening to things like linear perspective. I'm going to jump right over into color. The idea that the color has different values is giving us a feeling of depth here. The color itself between the hills doesn't really change much, and color is less important than that value overall when you're looking at depth. Color sets a mood, and the value in this case helps us see the depth in our painting. I have a large area of dark here in the foreground, and I've chosen to put lettering inside that. I penciled it off and then transferred it over nicely, and now I need to paint around the outside edges to give it a feeling of light against dark. I will be able to see the lettering best when it's at its lightest or its darkest against a contrasting background. So my background will be very dark, but my letters will be very light. You can see them sort of appearing here as I paint. Now I did this picture all together with the lettering on the original, so what I have here are pencil lines that I've already put in. But I could have done this on a separate piece of paper and transferred them separately, putting one in one place, one in another, or doing a whole picture and then putting other stuff on top of it by transferring it from other sources. This allows us to use multiple pages and put them together in a composition without having them all drawn out on the same piece of paper first. Counterintuitive, but it is actually easier for me to paint around the letters into the negative space than it is for me to paint the letters on top of the background. And you're going to see here in just a moment, I do a major mess up where I drop the brush. Did you see that? Now the good news is I can fix that later on with a little bit of white paint. I can still paint the letters on top of this background once it dries. If I had done that onto the wash that's through the sky or the water, I'd be kind of toast at this point because I used a wash and I can't emulate that or pull the paint off. But I can put more layers of paint on with acrylic paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint all of these nice pieces and get them everything finished, and then I'm going to go in with a small brush and just touch up the white areas, and then I'm going to go in with the dark paint again and trim up the white areas on the final picture. Here then we have that same picture in acrylic. Notice I ended up with a couple of splatters in the distance, so what did I do? I made them into birds flying over the hills in the distance. If we look way into the distance, we see the lightest hills, and as they come forward closer to us, they get darker and darker until we see the silhouette of the tree in the foreground. This creates an illusion of depth, along with the contour lines that were the original picture and all of our different rules of perspective working together. Often Leonardo da Vinci is credited with discovering atmospheric perspective, or the perspective of disappearance. As things get farther from us, they disappear into an atmospheric haze. In this case, that means that we can see less detail and less contrast in the distance.